So, good afternoon. And thank you all for coming. Have some opening announcements, and then we're going to hear from our presenters. So I'm Harriet Kuhr. I'm the Executive Director of the International Rescue Committee in Charlottesville. And I want to welcome everyone here on behalf of the Virginia Foundation of the Humanities and the Virginia Festival of the Book. A few reminders. Please silence your cell phone. If you like to tweet, you can tweet about this event at hashtag VABook2017. We want to thank the sponsors of this event, which is the International Rescue Committee and the Minority Rights Coalition. We also want to thank the City of Charlottesville for providing the venue for today's event and for broadcasting this program on Charlottesville's own TV 10. During the Q&A portion after the presentations, we ask that you please wait until a microphone is brought to you. This will allow us to record your question as part of that broadcast. My understanding is it gets rebroadcast at other times, so you might get a chance to see yourself in the future. So just reminding you about the festival, that we hope you'll continue to support the festival. It's free of charge, but not free of cost. If you're able, if you can go online or pick up an envelope from the information desk at the Omni to financially support the festival, it would be very much appreciated. You have green evaluations. We hope that you will fill them out and return them at the end of the session. If you prefer to do it online, you can also find an online version of the evaluation at vabook.org/survey. We have book sales here for after the end of the event. And I understand both of you will stay, you'll sign you can, if you want to purchase the books, the authors will sign them. And this also supports the festival. So this session is called Navigating International Conflicts, Who Helps the Refugees? So we have with us author Christine Mahoney, author of Failure and Hope, Fighting for the Rights of the Forcibly Displaced. She's an associate professor of public policy and politics at the Frank Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy and director of social entrepreneurship at UVA. And we also have Jennifer Rubenstein, who is author of Between Samaritans and States, The Political Ethics of Humanitarian INGOs. And she is an associate professor of political theory in the politics department at UVA. So I think what our idea is to have maybe a 15 to 20 minute presentation from each of our speakers, just talking about their work. And then we'll follow up maybe with some questions, and then we will also turn it over to the audience. I assume that, like all Charlottesville audiences, you will be full of questions, and they're usually really good ones too. So we want to make sure you have a chance to do that. So turning it over to Christine.
Sure, thank you.
Thanks.
As many of you know, last year the world hit a new record. 65 million people displaced worldwide by violent conflict. And while the Syrian crisis, which this is an image of one of the Syrian refugee camps, is the most well-known, and it is the largest, it's also important to remember that this is not the only crisis worldwide. In fact, there are over 65 different protracted displacement crises where people have been fleeing violence and have been displaced for years. This has led the UN High Commissioner for Refugees to say that the UN has never had to address so much human misery. And not only has the problem grown, but it's also changed. When the UN High Commissioner for Refugees was set up, the UNHCR, it was set up to help people temporarily fleeing their homes, and help them in this short amount of time before they needed to return home. Unfortunately, return home is no longer an option for most refugees and internally displaced persons, especially in situations like failed states in Syria and Somalia. People fleeing conflict today are displaced for years and often decades. The average that the UN estimates is if you're displaced today, you'll be displaced for at least 17 years. So the international humanitarian response of temporary shelter and temporary food is no longer sufficient. During these years of displacement, refugees and internally displaced persons, or what we call IDPs, are in a terrible state of limbo. Unable to work freely or move freely, they're unable to care for themselves and their families. And because of national and international policy, they're actually worse off than the extremely poor. I interviewed a family in Bosnia of Bosnian refugees that were still stuck in limbo in camps in 2008 when I began my fieldwork. And these people had been displaced since the breakup of the wars of Yugoslavia. And this case particularly shows the strange distinction between refugees and what we call internally displaced. People that were all citizens of one country, the former Yugoslavia, suddenly found themselves as refugees or internally displaced persons, depending on random geography and which direction they fled. I visited a camp which had existed since 1995, which housed Croatian IDPs, returnees from Serbia, Bosnian refugees, and ex-refugee settlers from Bosnia, which would not be able to return home because their apartments had been taken over by Serbs. The temporary dwellings that people were living in were falling apart. They could no longer stand up to the weather and the conditions after 13 long years. The water pump had become polluted by heavy metals, forcing the refugees to go gather water by a nearby stream by bucket. And even though this was a very, very long displacement, 13 years, one of the women that I interviewed actually broke down crying, telling me about the night that Serbs pushed her and her family at knife point out of their houses, and how her daughter, who was about to start college that year, had her life permanently put on hold. It's this type of limbo where people are not allowed to work and not allowed to move freely that most people are enduring. So this camp that I visited in southern Croatia was just the first camp that I did fieldwork in. And it didn't prepare me for the type of suffering that I would see and witness in camp after camp, country after country, as I saw hundreds of thousands of refugees and IDPs living at the edge of existence. I gathered data on advocacy around all 65 of those protracted cases that I showed you on the map, conducted in-depth interviews with over 170 aid workers in 7 specific conflict zones, and did interviews with humanitarian aid workers, UN staff, and refugee representatives. And what I found in country after country was heartbreakingly depressing. That failure is the norm when it comes to advocating for these people's rights. And what I want to really focus on is the right to work and the right to move. I thought that I'd find success stories, examples for us to follow in other crises where UN staff and international organizations were able to effectively fight for rights. But what I found is that failure is often the norm. And so I think it's important to address the fact that there are significant barriers to rights-based advocacy so that we don't unnecessarily spend scarce resources and time trying to raise energy and awareness that will not ultimately improve the lives of the displaced. I want to focus on, I'm going to be talking today about refugees that are in their first countries of asylum. So I work with Harriet with the IRC here in Charlottesville as well. So I just want to make sure we're focusing on refugees abroad, Syrians that first flee to Turkey, Syrians that first flee to Iraq, Bhutanese that flee to Nepal, for example. And I'll talk about some of these cases. I'm going to outline 5 different barriers that really make advocacy, rights-based advocacy, difficult in the field, in these countries where refugees first flee to. And then I'm going to talk about a solution that I think will work. So the first major barrier to fighting for the right to work is that advocacy is not the priority. Of the UN and international aid organizations, which Jen will speak about, their mission is life-saving food and medicine, keeping people alive. Any humanitarian aid worker you speak with in the Dadaab refugee camp, which is on the Kenyan-Somali border where I did field work, wants improved access to rights. They want the displaced to be able to work, to move, and ultimately to return home. But unfortunately, home is an endless war zone, and the rights to food and water are not even being met. One of the lead implementing partners that I interviewed while I was there described where they were directing their energy. And I want to point out that it is not on the right to work or the right to move. And I'll give you a quote. We pump water for 18 hours a day to make sure refugees are getting sufficient amounts of water. When we had only 200,000 refugees, we were providing 18 liters a day, which is the international standard. But now, with more refugees, there's over 400,000 refugees there now. That means our water capacity per person has gone down, and we're falling short of international standards. And benchmarks are being missed in all areas. Dozens of infants die every day from malnutrition. Maternal mortality is high, and security continues to deteriorate as Al-Shabaab, which is the rebel group there, continues to do attacks inside the camps. The aid organizations providing emergency relief on the front lines simply do not have the resources nor the bandwidth to engage in effective rights-based advocacy. The second major barrier to effective advocacy on the ground is that the displaced are not a priority. They're non-priority citizens. If you take cases like Kenya, Thailand, Turkey, Nepal, Tanzania, Ecuador, or many others, these are just a few of the subset of countries that are hosting refugees. They're all developing countries with their own developing challenges, and their governments are not even able to meet basic infrastructure needs of their own citizens. Their governments have a responsibility to their citizens that they don't have the capacity to meet. And so providing rights to refugees, who are often seen as a burden and a threat, is not a priority. This also holds in the case of internally displaced persons. You might think, well, they're citizens of these countries they're displaced in. But often they're seen as a problematic minority, like the Acholi in northern Uganda, or as an enemy to be destroyed, as in the case of the Tamils in Sri Lanka. The third major barrier to effective rights advocacy in the field is that international aid and UN agencies have no political leverage. My fieldwork in the Bhutanese refugee camps in Nepal, some of you may have met some Bhutanese refugees here in Charlottesville, has shown that the governments of Nepal and the governments of Bhutan do not care what the UN has to say about rights or about the rights of the Bhutanese Lhotshampas to return home. After over a decade of advocacy, they were no closer to the Bhutanese refugees being able to return home, nor being able to integrate locally into Nepal. And hundreds of thousands of these Bhutanese refugees had been living in stick huts for over 2 decades, over 20 years, on a floodplain in a river. Entire generations had been born and raised in leaky stick huts with mud floors, mud walls, raging insects, all made worse every year by monsoons and as the huts would kind of wash away. There'd be major cholera outbreaks as the latrines overflowed. And the Nepali government would simply not allow them to become citizens, and they would not allow them to move freely, nor were they allowed to work. Most people sat around every day, all day, being forced into aid dependence. I interviewed a man with a disabled brother, and that they had no access to any kind of schooling, any kind of special education care. He was forced to sit in a hut every day for 15 years. And as we walked around the camp, we were followed by little children who were hungry because the price of oil globally had gone up, which meant the price of rice had gone up. And with the UN having fixed resources, they weren't able to buy the appropriate food basket any longer. International organizations and the UN agencies have no political leverage, trying to force governments to receive these refugees or to force different types of countries like Bhutan to take them home. The fourth major barrier, I'm only going to talk about 5, so we're nearly there, is that there's also corruption. Not only do aid groups not have the political leverage or economic leverage to pressure governments into access to rights for refugees, but corrupt government officials are actually often pressuring aid organizations, and the pressure is going the other way around. So while some of the aid workers I interviewed in Dadaab alluded to the type of corruption that I'm talking about, when I was in Mae Sot, which is the UN and international headquarters on the Thai-Burmese border, one was very explicit about it, and I'll give you another quote. "We have had trouble with the camp commander, the Palat, which is the Thai word for commander. He's very demanding. He makes demands on the NGOs, and if they aren't met, he tells the security forces to not let us in. So to do your work, you have to meet the demands. Other NGOs have shown up with a shipment, and the camp commander says, okay, that's 10 sacks of rice for me. They do it with bamboo, too. Every time there's a building material shipment, they take 10% of it. So it's very difficult for aid organizations to pressure governments into access to rights when those government officials are in fact pressuring them for access to resources. And then the final barrier that makes it very difficult to achieve rights-based advocacy on the ground is a lack of capacity. This is especially the case when there is internal displacement that's the result of rebel-based violence, as in the case of Colombia. I did field work in the paramilitary controlled zones, and what we found there is that the government knows about the displacement problem. There are local refugee rights organizations advocating for rights. And there is political will on part of the government to help the 4 million internally displaced people in Colombia. However, they just don't have the resources to do so. One local mayor said, well, I don't even have enough money to educate all of my own people. So how can you tell me I need more money and that I must have more money to assist these new people in my municipality? It's impossible. I have no money. So these barriers and this lack of resources, leverage, standing, and capacity make human rights advocacy on behalf of the displaced incredibly difficult. Rights-based advocacy has not and likely will not achieve an improved condition or set of conditions for the forcibly displaced. And I found this pretty depressing, right? My background is advocacy and activism. I always believed in the power of the people to rise up, and if they rose their voices loud enough, policymakers would respond and change policy. But it doesn't work in this case. I think we need a different strategy. And I struggled for 2 years to figure out what that was. So it took me a little while to get this book out. And finally, I settled on something that I think will work. The only way you achieve influence is through leverage, right? And that's usually either political leverage, we won't vote for you again, as we use in the United States in our democracy, or it's economic leverage, right? If things are working well. Mobilizing political power is difficult, and refugees have no political power, right? They're not citizens of the countries they're residing in. International aid organizations have no political leverage either. And IDPs, even though they may have de facto power because they are citizens of a country, they may have de jure citizenship and rights. They don't have any de facto power. But there is a way forward. I believe that concerned global citizens can mobilize economic leverage through impact investment funds. The idea here is that we can directly empower the lives of the displaced and the communities hosting them through microfinance for refugee and host community entrepreneurs. This will directly improve the conditions of the displaced. But importantly, we know that these entrepreneurs are starting. It's amazing. They find a way to start even though they've lost all resources and they've lost their family members and they've gone through incredible hardships. They pop up things like bakeries and shops and restaurants in the camps. And I think we can help them. And we're actually going to be doing this. My husband and I founded a fund this year called the Alight Fund to invest in refugee and host community entrepreneurs. But we take it one step further than just directly trying to improve lives. It takes 2 steps. First, we're going to raise an impact investing fund to support these people directly, help them grow their businesses, employ more displaced and host community members, and improve lives. But second, we will raise an additional fund to target this problem of a lack of leverage for rights-based advocacy. This second fund will use as a carrot to encourage host governments to advance access to the right to work. In this way, I think that we can begin moving the needle on the displacement crisis, which we've been seeing continue for over 70 years now. FDR famously said that people who are hungry and out of a job are the stuff of which dictatorships are made. An updated version of this might be, are the stuff of which terrorism is made. If we allow the status quo to continue, allow millions to remain displaced, hungry, and without a job, disillusionment will turn into despair and extremism and endless cycles of violence. But I do believe there is another path, one in which we can stand up and support some of the most vulnerable individuals in the world. These displaced have fled war, persecution, and violence to save themselves and their families. Their stories are harrowing and inspiring. We do have the opportunity to invest in them and their future, in the development of countries in crisis, and ultimately a more promising future for us all. Thanks.
Should I go ahead? Okay. So I'm really glad to be here with all of you today, and my thanks to Harriet and Christine for doing this with me. Everything that I'm going to say really complements, unfortunately, the first part of Christine's talk, her sort of description of the situation with refugees. I'm talking about a particular kind of actor that doesn't only work on refugees, but insofar as they do work on refugees, the picture that I'm going to present to you is very consistent with what she said, unfortunately. Okay, so you've probably heard the saying that when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. When you're a scholar of politics, everything looks political. So political theorists over the last several decades have argued that emotions are political, that the senses are political, and of course that the personal is political. But one thing that they strangely haven't seen as political are international humanitarian NGOs such as Oxfam Care and Doctors Without Borders. And those are the kinds of organizations that my book is about and that I'm going to be talking about today. So while in one sense it's sort of odd that political theorists who want everything to be political have sort of overlooked these actors, in another sense I think it's very understandable. These organizations do charitable life-saving work, providing food, water, and medical care to victims of conflict or natural disasters. We want to think of them as pure, heroic do-gooders who stand apart from the dirty, messy world of politics. That's so attractive. We want something like that. And humanitarian organizations themselves contribute to this perception of them as apolitical by explicitly describing themselves as impartial and neutral. So here's a screenshot of a webpage of Doctors Without Borders, also known as Médecins Sans Frontières or MSF, and this is from a few weeks ago. And you can see in the corner up there where they describe themselves as neutral and impartial, but below you see them taking a position on a particular policy issue. Right, and you can see it says, I put the quote down here, President Donald J. Trump's executive order suspending refugee resettlement to the U.S. is an inhumane act against people fleeing war zones, right? So not a neutral position. So here's another example, a statement about the reinstatement of the Mexico City policy on abortion. And this policy basically says that if you fund or support or in any way organizations that have anything to do with abortion, the U.S. government won't give you money. Right. So this is just one instance of a broader claim that I defend in my book. And it's that even if they claim to be neutral and impartial, and even if they sincerely intend to stay out of politics some or all of the time, large-scale humanitarian INGOs are political actors. And as I'll explain, I mean this in a much broader sense than that they take positions on particular government policies. So in my book, I draw on field work, less than Christine's, but I'm a political theorist, and we can talk about that. I draw on field work, archival research, and secondary scholarship to answer 4 questions. The first is, okay, so if humanitarian INGOs are political actors, what kind of political actors are they? Second, what sorts of ethical predicaments do they regularly face? So Christine was talking about all these constraints on the ground that these organizations face. So what are the sort of ethical conflicts that they have to navigate because of those constraints? The third question I try to answer is, okay, can we identify better and worse ways for them to navigate those constraints? Even if we can't say what they should do, all things considered, are there things that we can exclude? And then the fourth thing that I talk about in my book that I'm not really going to talk about at all today is, what does this example of humanitarian INGOs tell us about some of the concepts that political theorists and the rest of us think about all the time, concepts such as democracy, equality, humanitarianism, and justice, right? So how do those concepts get deployed and specified in this particular context? I'm going to be talking mostly about the first 3 questions, not that last one today. So the large mainstream Western-based multi-mandate INGOs like Oxfam Care, Doctors Without Borders, World Vision, that are the subject of my book, are a very small subset of all NGOs. However, even this small subset is still very diverse. As one Italian aid worker told me, they have different souls. They also interact with a whole host of other actors, right? Not only donor governments, donors, aid recipients, but also host governments, for-profit humanitarian organizations, paramilitary organizations, religious organizations, etc. So this is a really complex, differentiated field that we're talking about. So on the one hand, as I noted earlier, these INGOs are sometimes perceived as heroes or do-gooding machines that reliably transform your dollars into lives saved or suffering alleviated, right? That's what you want. You give your money and you want some good to happen as a result. On the other hand, critics frequently describe these organizations as culturally and politically obtuse, inefficient, unaccountable to their intended beneficiaries, blindly technocratic, tone-deaf to how their actions are perceived by local people, beholden to their donors, and insufficiently responsive to issues of injustice, to name just a few criticisms that have been lodged against these organizations. And you can see these criticisms in books with very subtle titles, such as The Selfish Altruist, The Dark Side of Virtue, The Road to Hell, and Famine Crimes. And these are just a few. So in contrast to both of these views, both the do-gooding machine superhero view and the, oh my God, these organizations are terrible criminals view, I think that we should view them, as I said, as political actors that regularly face daunting ethical predicaments in which all available courses of action require moral compromise. The question is, what's the best of all these bad choices? And so the rest of my comments are going to proceed in 4 steps. First, I'm going to give you some concrete examples of ethical predicaments that humanitarian INGOs regularly face. Next, I'll enumerate some existing approaches to humanitarian INGO ethics, and I'm just going to assert that they fall short. I don't have time to explain to you why, but we can talk about that in the Q&A. I'll then present what I think is a better approach, and then I'll explain how what this approach tells us about some of these examples that I'm about to tell you about. Okay, and the alternative approach that I'm going to sort of defend to you is what I call pluralist consequentialism, and I'll explain what that means. Okay. And then finally, I'll gesture really briefly towards some broader implications of my argument. All right, so let's start with some examples of the difficult ethical predicaments that humanitarian INGOs regularly face. In my book, I talk about 4 of these. Today, I'm only going to talk about 2. So in 1994, the Tutsi Rwandan Patriotic Front routed the Hutu Rwandan Armed Forces, or FAR, ending the Rwandan genocide. So hundreds of thousands of Hutu fled Rwanda into different surrounding countries, one of which was Zaire. And so in this mix of Hutu, there were legitimate refugees, there were also perpetrators of genocide, abettors of genocide, and the FAR, the Hutu army, was right in there with them, living in the camps with them, okay, sort of surrounding themselves with civilians. And several INGOs, including Oxfam Care and Doctors Without Borders, were working in these camps, and they found themselves facing a wrenching decision. Should they continue to provide water, medical care, and other services in the camps, knowing that in so doing they were helping the Hutu army, they were helping the ex-FAR to kind of reassert themselves and gain strength because they were in there among the civilians? Or should they withdraw and deprive the ex-FAR of all the food and the water and the shelter and the legitimacy they were giving them, but in so doing deprive the refugees in the camp of these services that they needed, right? So humanitarian INGOs working in conflict settings regularly face ethical predicaments with this same structure. And this connects to the point about corruption that you were talking about, right? Do you stay and continue providing resources and continue with your presence that legitimizes the other actors on the ground, knowing that you're indirectly enabling them to commit injustice or cause harm? Or do you withdraw and don't do those things, but then you're depriving people of food and resources and other things that they need? Okay, so that's one ethical predicament, okay? Another one involves resource allocation. So as Christine also said, these organizations have a limited amount of resources. They have to figure out what they're going to do with them, right? So in 2000, the town of Gulu in northwest Uganda was struck by an Ebola epidemic. And conventional wisdom at the time was that Ebola epidemics in rural areas burn out on their own fairly quickly. However, MSF, Doctors Without Borders, was one of the few organizations providing health care in the area. The government wasn't doing it. This was the main source of basic health care that people had. But MSF decided to divert resources away from its basic health care programs to address this Ebola epidemic. And one MSF employee defended this decision on the grounds that, quote, alleviation of suffering and dying indignity was enormously important. We know we saved very few lives. But another asked, quote, how would you explain to a villager from the outskirts of Gulu the choice MSF made in addressing the problem of Ebola and helping people die with dignity, but not the health problems in his village? Okay? So here's another example of an ethical predicament involving resource allocation. And this was described to me by an MSF employee named Kenny Gluck, and here's what he said. We treat tuberculosis in South Sudan. It is incredibly expensive. We fly in the doctors and the nurses, we fly in the labs. A reasonable person thinking with the utilitarian mind will say, why don't you just do that when you're in Uganda? You're practically in the same area. You can treat these people for 1/10 of the cost. You'd save 10 times more lives with that amount of money. Well, could these people have been stuck in this war zone, facing massacre and mere genocide for 50 years? That's why we're working with them. So in both the Ebola and the tuberculosis cases, the central question is, how much weight should INGOs put on saving lives, and how much weight should they put on other aims that are more difficult or even impossible to measure and commensurate with saving lives, such as helping people die with dignity, expressing outrage, or standing in solidarity with the population? Okay, and the other two ethical predicaments I talk about in my book are about advocacy and INGOs' use of visual images, and we can talk about that in the Q&A if you want. All right, so with these examples in mind, let me now turn to some common approaches to conceptualizing the role and ethical responsibilities of humanitarian INGOs. And in my book, I argue that all of these, they offer important insights and they raise important questions, and I don't think they're like dumb or wrong or anything like that, but I really think they're inadequate, both individually and together, for sort of grappling with the kinds of problems that I was just telling you about. These are that humanitarian INGOs are and should be rescuers of the people they seek to assist, equal partners with domestic NGOs or governments in the countries where they work, agents for their donors, agents for their intended beneficiaries. A fifth conception is the idea that they should be accountable to their intended beneficiaries. That's really great and important, but it's not enough. A sixth approach focuses on traditional humanitarian principles, such as humanity, impartiality, and neutrality. And the final two are that INGOs, these are more critical accounts, but I think even these are not enough to help us grapple with these issues, are that INGOs are not significantly different from neocolonial governments, and or that they're pretty much just like multinational corporations. Okay, so I don't think any of these common ways of thinking about humanitarian INGOs are sufficient. So let me sketch what I think is a better approach. And this is going to be pretty abstract. I'm a political theorist, but bear with me. We're going to make it more concrete. Okay. So I think we should think of humanitarian INGOs as somewhat governmental, highly political, and often second best. And let me explain to you what I mean by each of these things. So I've been talking about humanitarian NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and yet they sometimes engage in two specific kinds of governance. First, they engage in conventional governance when they undertake governance functions that are roughly analogous to those performed by conventional domestic governments. So when they are in a camp and they're the only or one of the only providers of basic public goods, like water, food, medical care, they're basically taking on a governmental role. For example, in the Rwandan camps in Zaire, this is what the NGOs, I think, arguably were doing. Likewise, when MSF is the only healthcare provider in the area and it's deciding whether it's going to deal with the Ebola epidemic or provide sort of basic health services for someone, this is something that we would ideally think that a government should be doing, right? So humanitarian INGOs engage in global governance because they help to constitute what scholars such as Michael Barnett have called the international humanitarian order. And this order manifests itself in both informal norms and formal umbrella organizations, such as the core humanitarian standard on quality and accountability. And we can talk about that later too if anyone wants. Okay. So even when humanitarian INGOs aren't engaged in governments, they're still highly political in two ways. First, even when they aim to stay out of politics, they frequently have political effects. For example, the INGOs in the Rwandan camps inadvertently helped to strengthen the ex-FAR, right, the Hutu army that was right in there. Second, INGOs exercise discursive power. And what I mean by this is they help to shape widely shared meanings and understandings. So when you think about issues like refugees, when you think about issues like famine, particular images come to mind. And humanitarian organizations have played a big role in shaping those images and shaping those understandings of these issues, not only through the images that they themselves circulate directly, but in the role they play in enabling reporters and journalists and photojournalists to take images and circulate them. So a lot of the images that you see in newspapers are taken by photojournalists who have been embedded with or helped out a lot by humanitarian organizations, right? So that's the discursive power part. And the third important feature of humanitarian INGOs is that they're often second best actors when they perform particular roles or functions. And what I mean by this is they do the kinds of things that other actors would do better if they were at full capacity. So most obviously, they do the kinds of things that governments would do better if they were there and functioning, right? So the big issue that this raises for humanitarian organizations is, okay, when should they keep acting and doing some particular activity, and when should they pull back and enable this sort of this first best actor to come to the fore, right? So George Bush, I think, said that when the Iraqis stand up, we'll stand down, that kind of thing. Is when should humanitarian organizations step back and let other actors who are better suited or more legitimate play a bigger role? So before describing what these three ideas tell us about the specific ethical predicaments I described earlier, I want to briefly sketch what they tell us about humanitarian INGO political ethics in general. So on the one hand, the more that INGOs engage in conventional governance, the more they act like governments, the more we want them to focus on the overall effects or consequences of their actions, right? So we want our government to think about the consequences of what it does, because those consequences affect so many people so profoundly, okay? The same holds for humanitarian organizations that engage in governance. They should be thinking about the large-scale consequences of their activities. On the other hand, the fact that they engage in global governance, are political, and often second best, suggests that this kinds of consequentialism, this focus on consequences, must be pluralist in form. It can't focus just on narrowly on one kind of value. It has to be open to, such as saving lives, it has to be open to a range of values, right? So in short, INGOs should navigate the ethical predicaments they face in what I call a pluralist consequentialist mode. Yes, they should focus on outcomes and consequences. That's what makes them consequentialist. But in so doing, they shouldn't limit themselves to one kind or source of value. That's what makes them pluralist. So to clarify this idea further, let me briefly distinguish it from some alternatives, okay? One is the idea, widespread in donor countries, that what really matters about INGOs is their intentions. They have good intentions. And I think that the assumption that this is what matters is a destructive fantasy. INGOs work in situations that are far too political and conflictual, and their knowledge and power is far too limited for their good intentions to be reliable predictors of consequences. Pluralist consequentialism also differs from the idea endorsed by some aid practitioners, and my students think this is totally crazy, but you will often hear this from aid practitioners, that what really matters is the intrinsic value of their actions, apart from whatever effects these actions might have. As one aid worker put it to me, I don't care if we can or cannot know that humanitarianism has improved the lives of others in need. I know that I must act. So this idea that what really matters is acting regardless of the consequences. I think that's also doesn't sufficiently acknowledge that action in these sorts of consequences can cause harm or contribute to injustice. Pluralist consequentialism also diverges from two other approaches that do focus on consequences but aren't pluralistic. One is so-called political humanitarianism, which suggests that humanitarian aid should always be leveraged in the service of one or a few broader, explicitly political aims, such as women's rights. And the last one is an idea that some of you might have heard of called effective altruism, that says that INGOs should simply maximize the number of quality-adjusted life years, or QALYs, that they provide per dollar spent. Okay, so this is pluralist consequentialism. What does it tell us about those two ethical conflicts that I described earlier? So first, remember the INGOs in the Rwandan refugee camps in Zaire. They're stuck between providing resources and enabling the Hutu army to manipulate them and use their resources to harm people. And on the other hand, or they pull out and refugees don't get the resources they need to live. The pluralist consequentialist approach suggests that we view the situation that INGOs faced in this situation as what I call drawing on the literature on the problem of dirty hands, the problem of spattered hands. On the one hand, this conceptualization takes seriously the idea that INGOs providing aid in the Rwandan camps were engaged in governance functions. Like politicians in dirty hands predicaments, they can't simply withdraw to keep their hands clean. They can't just simply leave and preserve their moral purity. On the other hand, the spattered hands framework acknowledges that by staying, INGOs contribute indirectly to injustice. Their hands are spattered by moral dirt created primarily by others. This suggests that INGOs facing spattered hands type situations should continue to provide aid when the benefits of doing so outweigh the costs, but they should view their spattered hands as something for which they owe a public explanation. And I can talk about that more later, how NGOs should publicly acknowledge the fact that they're constantly having to make these kinds of choices. While the spattered hands framework leaves a lot open, it rules out several lines of argument that are often invoked in debates about these types of situations and were actually invoked in the Rwanda case, including the argument that INGOs should do no harm and thusly should withdraw, and that they should just continue to provide aid regardless of the consequences because that's their remit. All right, so let me now briefly turn to the second ethical predicament, and this is the one about resource allocation. Do you save as many lives as possible, or do you stand with victims of genocide, for example? And I call this the cost-effectiveness conundrum. So how should INGOs navigate this conundrum? Insofar as their decisions about resource use function as a form of conventional governance, they must again attend to the overall consequences of their activities. But insofar as their decisions function as a form of global governance or discursive power, and insofar as they're second best actors, the consequences that they can and should promote are diverse. There should be room for INGOs to function as expressive political actors that take stands to ignite outrage and pressure first best actors to fulfill their responsibilities. And I propose that INGOs adopt what I call an ethics of resistance as a form of political judgment that acknowledges both the pull of both of these sources of responsibility. Okay. So in the conclusion of the book, I discuss the implications of this argument for donors to INGOs, people like you and me that want to support these organizations, and you've just gone through 100+ pages of all these horrible ethical predicaments they face. Now what should you do? Okay. And I argue that if INGOs, and I argue what you should do is adjust your expectations. If INGOs are political actors, then donating to them is less like putting coins in a do-gooding machine and more like donating to a candidate for elected office. And I explore what this means for the ethics of individual donating, right? When you donate to a candidate for elected office, you know that what's going to happen, the outcomes are messy and uncertain, and you do it anyway, right? And that's how I think we should think about humanitarian INGOs. In my more recent work, I've been thinking more generally about donating money as a form of political agency beyond humanitarianism, and here this intersects a bit with Christine's work. Including for fighting the effects of creeping authoritarianism in the US, right? Like money is a form of power. What kind of form of power is it? And because I was deeply struck by how the power of the concept of emergency shapes the worldview and actions of humanitarian organizations, both enabling them to do things and constraining them, I'm also now working on a project on the politics of emergency claim making. Thanks. How do I?
Let's see, I think we actually need to.
Should I don't know how to turn this off.
What?
It's so daunting. Oh, there it goes.
There, great, thanks. Gosh. I guess, I don't know, should we go ahead and turn it over to the audience? I'm thinking we probably need to stop about 3:15 to give people time to sign. Is there another program right after this one? Yeah, at 3:30?
We go to 3:45, I think.
Oh, at 4 o'clock, so we have time after. Okay. We can go to 3:30, okay. Where are the microphones? You've got one. Is there just the one? Okay. Yeah, does anybody have a question that you'd like to ask? Pardon?
Do you want to open with one while they
I guess I would be interested in hearing, because you're both academics, like if you've presented this information to people working in INGOs and kind of what kind of reactions you got from that.
Sure. Yes, it's been interesting, actually. As being an academic, you're always worried about critique within the academy, and then you're thinking, is this a realistic, we both propose sets of solutions, is this realistic? I think both of us spend a lot of time thinking about the proposals we make in our conclusions, and so I've been quite surprised. My co-founder and I have presented this concept that we're moving forward at the World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul in June, a number of impact investing conferences in California and New York and Boston, and the response has been overwhelmingly positive. And so impact investors are very interested in thinking about, okay, I give philanthropically maybe to some of these types of organizations, but is there a way that I can use the core of my investment funds to also be directing some of those funds toward a for-profit helping in the refugee crisis. And that's what we're doing. We're starting a for-profit investment vehicle to support refugee entrepreneurs. And then at the same time, many people in the UN and the aid community have recognized that the humanitarian relief system is broken, right? This idea of temporary responses to decade-long problems is no longer sufficient, and they know that. And so there's an openness in the international aid community like we've never seen before to more innovative social entrepreneurial kind of impact investing approaches that are more shifting from kind of emergency response to more long-term economic development. So that's been exciting because it's been pretty positively received.
So, should I answer? Okay. So when I first started working on this project, which came out of my dissertation, I thought I was going to write one book that was going to be perfectly understandable and interesting to everyone from 22-year-old aid workers on the ground to my colleagues in the academy. And that, maybe somebody else can do it, but I could not. And the reason, I think, is in part not only because people are sort of looking to learn different kinds of things, but the specialized vocabularies in all of these contexts are really so different. So something that will be crystal clear to a political theorist will make absolutely no sense to the 22-year-old aid worker. So what I found is that the practitioners who've engaged most with my stuff have tended to be the sort of higher level manager types, right? And I have gotten emails from aid workers exactly. But I think the reality is that all of these endeavors are really specialized, and that's as true for humanitarian workers as it is for scholars. And we all have our vocabularies and the kinds of background information that we have. And so I think what this means, the good news, I think, is it means we have to work together and we have to continue to talk to each other, and no one person is going to be able to, I think, effectively move across, like sort of fully encompass these domains. And so the outcome of interest isn't a book, it's a conversation.
Mm-hmm. I know, I'm going to ask my own question first, I could take a precedence, but I know within IRC and our work around the world, there's been a lot of talk about use of cash transfer, like instead of giving refugees in camps like rations of food, or just give them cash cards and let them decide how to spend the money. And I think, because they'll use it the way they most need it, but also because then that money flows back into local communities as opposed to, or the surrounding host communities. Does that have any, have any similarity with like what you're
Definitely
doing? Yeah.
And so this is an interesting shift. So you can imagine if an INGO in the United States wants to give plastic sheeting, right? And we all in this room all give our $10 and it's aggregated and it buys plastic sheeting in the United States. And then it needs to be shipped over to the Kenyan border. And then it needs to be trucked in many, many hours, right? And that truck hits a flat tire, right? And then you can imagine the resources that just get sunk. And so there has been a shift, and the U.S. Has shifted toward giving our aid in conditional cash transfers, and some people talk about conditional cash transfers, which is some requirements around those cash transfers. So this is becoming popular in refugee crises. My co-founder and I were in northern Iraq over the Thanksgiving break, and we met with Mercy Corps and World Vision, which are two big INGOs, and they're doing cash transfers right now. And it is a really good kickstart to the local markets, right? So if there's someone that's selling some locally made material that can be used as housing stock rather than plastic being shipped all the way from the United States, for example, it can support a small business owner there. And so our hope is that the next step, right, there's a first wave of aid, but ultimately the gap and the need is so massive that philanthropic aid alone is not going to be sufficient. And so that's why there's been this interest in private sector engagement in the global refugee crisis. Some of you may have heard President Obama started a Partnership for Refugees initiative in the summertime, encouraging private sector actors to get involved in this. Over 70 different big companies, big and small companies, our companies included in there, have made commitments to begin supporting long-term economic development through market-based growth. And so those cash transfers are really important for that first kickstart, right? A refugee can get a cash transfer and maybe they start a small bakery and then they start having a business. And then if organizations like our Impact Investing Fund can come behind that and give a capital loan so they can grow their business, that means more refugees are employed, more income coming into households. So yeah, I think that's a critical step.
So cash transfers are the big new thing, not only in emergency contexts, but also in development contexts. So there's an organization called Give Directly that lets you give cash directly to people in poor countries. And there's been a lot of empirical work on cash transfers in development contexts, trying to show what its effects are. And there's been some work on cash transfers in more emergency contexts. And I think it was an ODI or HPG report, I can't remember the name of the report, but basically saying that the overall upshot of the empirical research is that in a lot of situations, cash transfers are really good. And that the question that aid organizations should be asking always is, why aren't we doing cash transfers? So that should be the default. Now, of course, if you think about this from the material interest perspective of a lot of these aid organizations and aid workers, this can be really threatening, right? Because you have a lot of resources and other things devoted to this whole process of getting actual material resources to other people. So it can be threatening to you as an organization to all of a sudden just be handing over cash. But I want to say one thing about why, from a more theoretical perspective, about why cash is good, and then another thing about the limitations of it. One really good thing about it is it's not paternalistic. Cash, an important thing about money is that it's fungible. You can use it to buy lots and lots of different things. And that means when you give somebody money, especially when you give them an unconditional cash transfer, you're not telling them what they should do. They have a wide range of options of what they should do. And insofar as you think non-paternalism is really important and autonomy is really important, that cash transfers make sense. But a limitation of cash transfers, there's sort of two. One is that all that money can buy is what money can buy, right? And so there's some things that people want that are just not available in a particular kind of emergency situation, or there's some kinds of exchanges that we think are sort of morally reprehensible, right? So there's some things we think money shouldn't be able to buy. And for all those kinds of, like love, for example, friendship, for all those kinds of things, cash transfers aren't going to work. And another thing that cash transfers aren't really doing yet is things involving political change and politics and people working together, right? There's a little bit of work trying to do cash transfers to communities and to groups to invest in public goods, but insofar as cash transfers are to individuals, there's a lot of sort of like political action, joint action that cash can't get translated into. So that's kind of how I think about the cash transfer situation.
Thanks.
I'm going to take the conversation way down. We're sitting here writing our checks to charity. Who should we write them to? And
That's what I was going to ask. Yeah.
Ms. Mahoney, could you tell us more about the fund that you're starting? You said it's a for-profit making fund, and who will make the profits, who they'll go to, and how that will help the goals of the fund.
Sure. So I think, and again, there's different ways you can think about this, but in the first days and weeks of an emergency, people need emergency help, right? But as these crises are prolonged into years and years, the Syrian crisis is now in its 6th year, I think we need to think about long-term economic development. So I think if you're looking at different organizations that are working on the ground, looking at the type of work they're doing. There's very few organizations doing what we're going to be doing, and we're just getting started. We're only 5 months old now, which is investing capital in existing refugee and host community businesses. And then the profit will, return to the investment pool. And so the co-owners of the company and the investors in the company. Now, the plant, why do for-profit and why not do strictly nonprofit? That's because if we look at all of the philanthropic dollars in the world, it's kind of a small bar if we compare it to the money in the capital market. As any of you know in the room that may be investing or are investors or have some funds invested, there's been a shift toward socially responsible investing and impact investing, right? People want to make sure that they're not investing in tobacco and oil, and they'd rather be investing in companies that are doing good work. We're trying to create a fund so that people can invest in refugee businesses. We've got good evidence from the ground that there's many small businesses that are started by refugees. They're doing a good business. We met with sandwich shop owners and vegetable shop owners and bakery owners when we were in northern Iraq, and I've met them around such types of entrepreneurs around the world. They're doing a good business. If they have a little bit of capital to buy more raw materials, and they'll do even better business, and they'll be able to pay back their microloans. And so that's the idea around why for-profit and why investment. And I think if you're making your own decisions, I'd encourage you to think about how do we support these people in an empowered way, in a long-term economic development way, rather than just giving them a solar lantern and they're still stuck with no right to work and no right to move.
Can I say one thing in response to that question? The reason why it's really, really hard to figure out who you should write a check to is because you don't have the right information. What you have is tons and tons of detailed information about any one organization provided by that organization on its website, right? Or you have very, very vague, hard to interpret information on some of these like big, like GuideStar and Charity Navigator. And you have the big exposés of organizations like the Wounded Warrior Project when things really head south. And what you're missing, I think, is what you have in the context of politics. Think of how much you know about Tom Garrett, for example. And you have that information from a lot of different sources. And so I think there's a structural problem in this realm where we're missing that mediating layer of organizations that can provide you with the kind of information that you need to make this decision.
We've already seen where capitalism goes, so why can't we try something different, like an exchange of labor for free resources?
Well, there's some interesting things happening in that space. So some of you may have heard about encrypted currency, things like Bitcoin. There are some tech entrepreneurs that are working on cryptocurrencies so that you can bypass the big banks and bypass financial institutions. So this would allow essentially a bartering type economy to start. And this is being tested in Kenya, in refugee camps in Kenya. So essentially, if I'm a baker and you are a shoemaker, and neither of us have any cash because we're out in the middle of the desert, we could use a kind of a different form of exchange, which would be this like virtual, essentially we would have some type of cell phone and we could trade on that. It sounds technical, but it's quite doable, and people are advancing it. So I think that there is a big space for that. I'm also interested in open source. So it's another tech term, but essentially open source is sharing the information of how do we build hydroponic systems with found materials? And I figure it out, and Jen doesn't know how to do it, but she reads my guidance, and then she can build her own with found materials. And so suddenly we're both doing agriculture out back of our tents, and we didn't need to pay anyone, and we don't need to pay anyone back. And so there's people thinking about that, and that's another, it's an area to explore if you're interested in kind of open source and kind of counter traditional capitalistic systems.
What I would say is that if what you want is profound political change at the structural level, humanitarianism is not for you. Humanitarianism is a really conservative political project, I think. And the reason I say that is it pretends not to be political. So the aim of humanitarianism is to get things back to the way they were with as little disruption as possible. So I mean conservative in the sort of Burkean sense of conserving things as they are. So it sounds like one thing you might think about is, on the one hand, like there is like an obvious moral urgency and imperative to providing food and water to people who would die otherwise, right? But on the other hand, the sort of broader sort of imaginary of humanitarianism isn't about profound structural change. And that, by the way, historically has not always been true. Like the abolition movement was humanitarian, right? But nowadays, I think humanitarianism has a much more conservative aspect to it.
I'm curious about the response of the governments in these areas where you are working on the refugees having their own businesses. Are they supportive of it? Are there any barriers for these folks to be able to do this?
Yes, that's why it's a two-stage idea, right? The first stage is to show that it would work somewhere where refugees are legally allowed to work, and then move somewhere where they're not and use the investment capital as a political incentive. So there's only really one place where refugees are legally allowed to work, and that's in Iraq. So by the Constitution, refugees are legally allowed to work. There's 250,000 Syrian refugees there. They're Kurdish Syrians, and they're in the Kurdish area of Iraq, and they have been welcomed with open arms. They're starting businesses. There's open trade between the refugees in the camp and the host community outside. That's quite rare. It's not the norm. In almost every other case on the planet, refugees are seen as a threat to jobs and a threat to security. And so that's why and that's just been the case, right? And advocating, we can advocate till we're blue in the face, and that's not going to change until we change having some leverage. And so that's why I'm arguing, let's use impact investing funds as economic leverage. The European Union actually finally did that this last year. And they said, we're going to invest X amount of money into Jordan, but it's conditional on you releasing work permits. And so 250,000 work permits were released, and special economic zones were set up. There is some openness to doing such special economic zones in Turkey as well, so that looks like it may move forward. And there is a shocking beginning openness to this in Kenya. So many of you may have known about the Kakuma refugee camp, where many lost boys of Sudan were before they came to the United States. There is finally, that camp I think has been there 30 years. There is now a plan to depopulate that into a local town where people would be allowed to become integrated and have right to work. But there are, countless examples where people have never been allowed to become citizens, like the Burundian refugees in Tanzania that were there since 1976. So yes, there's generally a pushback from local governments, and so I think we need to change the calculation around that.
Hi, this goes back to Jennifer, when you were talking about finding that right mediating layer to get at the most effective ideas. I was quite moved by the book Half the Sky by Christophe and Douan, which was not about refugees per se, but about the plight of women in developing countries around the world. And he made a big point of saying a lot of ideas that we all think are perfect and really targeted end up not working out. And an example he gave was providing a bicycle to a young girl so she could get to school, and the bike was then stolen and routinely stolen. But then he points to, if you provide iodine in the water in a little community, then everybody's health goes way up and it's really effective. So how do we get those right targeted ideas?
So there has been a big movement in the development context toward, one example is sort of randomized controlled trials, which is where they're really trying to sort of import scientific, quasi-scientific methods from other fields into the context of development to exactly figure this stuff out. Right, because there's millions and millions of examples, and people have like a weird attraction to them, right? It's like Encyclopedia Brown mysteries of like, why did this thing that looks so good fail? And then you're an insider when you understand, right? There's a satisfyingness to those narratives. But so they're trying to do these randomized controlled trials to exactly figure this out. So in cash transfers, like people want to give money to Kiva, what actually happens to people who start these businesses, right? Do their kids drop out of school because they're now being like needed in the family business? Who gets the money? How does this affect power dynamics within the family? Is there more violence? Like, these are things you can look at empirically. And the problem, so that all sounds great, right? And there's organizations like the Poverty Action Lab at MIT that are trying to do exactly this. So this sounds great. What's the problem? The problem is the kinds of things that you can test with this amount of rigor tend to be really small scale, apolitical, technological fixes. So there's this effective altruism movement that I mentioned. They support these organizations that are called meta charities, and they take all of these studies and they try to digest them and they try to figure out what are the best organizations in this very rigorous way, and they end up only endorsing organizations that do very sort of technical, typically public health kinds of interventions. And what's ended up happening is that basically the empirical rigor tail is wagging the whole dog, right? And so things that are more political, things that are more advocacy oriented, because they're so hard to measure using these methodologies, fall by the wayside. So, a lot of people are aware of this and are working on this. And so I think what has to happen is that the sort of effective altruist model of being sort of empirically rigorous needs to be expanded to a wider range of kinds of actions and interventions.
She did, yeah, it was her.
Hi. When you talked about the investment fund, I'm having a hard time figuring out, there's a camp, and say a woman starts a bakery in this little camp. Now, how do you make the leap from the camp to a self-sustaining business outside of the camp? And is this what the investment fund is all about?
Sure.
And also, just one little step farther, are we now talking about publicly traded investment funds?
No on the publicly traded investment fund. So we're starting small. We're talking, $200, $250 microloans, depending on the country we're talking about. And just helping them scale up businesses that they already know how to do. They're bringing the business acumen from, the places they fled. They know how to do it. But to get, raw materials or products for them to scale up is the idea because they have no access to capital or banking right now. In some cases, it could be a camp that has a nearby community, which is what we see in northern Iraq, right? There's essentially a camp right near a community, and there's trade happening at the edge of the camp. There's no fences, there's no policing or anything like that. That could work. In other places like the Dadaab refugee camp, there is almost no community there at all. There's 400,000 Somali refugees in the middle of nowhere in the desert, and there's maybe 50 people in the local town, which is just shacks, right? So there's not a big opportunity for trade there. What we're seeing is as the global displacement crisis has exploded, many people are not in camps now. So if we look at Jordan, about 90% of the refugees are actually embedded in the towns and the cities. If we look at the 2 to 4 million people displaced in Turkey, they're squatting in areas, they're renting apartments. The rents in Lebanon have quadrupled because the refugees are in the city and they are among the people. And it is also the case in northern Iraq, where the refugees are among the people in the cities. And these are, I think, the best cases for investment, because if I'm a baker and I'm living in this, and I'm a Syrian refugee in Jordan, and Jen's my neighbor, we live next door to each other, and she can buy bread from me, and she doesn't need to come all the way out to my refugee camp to do so. So that's what it could look like.
So I understand that a lot of the sort of developing countries, particularly with the Syrian refugee crisis surrounding Syria, are the ones who host the lion's share of the refugees. Do you have any ideas or kind of plans for countries in Europe, say where 1 million refugees are headed right now, who have the resources, I guess, to better deal with kind of the burden of this crisis, and how to leverage those resources in order to help, I guess, the social entrepreneurship in order to bolster these refugees' lives?
Sure. It's interesting, and this is where there's a big difference between the refugee crisis we're hearing about in Europe and refugees in the United States. So in some ways, Harriet's work is very difficult, but she's lucky because when refugees come here, they're legally allowed to work. They've already gone through a really detailed refugee vetting process, thank you. Yeah. And they come here with the right to work. Since people are fleeing, they're essentially asylum seekers, right? They're fleeing into Europe on foot, and then they're declaring themselves and saying, I'm a refugee. At that point, they're an asylum seeker, and they have to wait to get refugee status. And so in some countries like Switzerland, it's taking 2 and 3 years. So they're sitting there not legally allowed to work. So once someone gets, and it's very different for different member states of the European Union and different even non-members of the European Union, like Switzerland. So once someone gets the right to work, I think there's a huge opportunity there, right? They're going to be embedded in much healthier economies. And I think if they have access to capital, they will do very well, and it'll be good for the market. But that's just one of the things. I haven't met anyone doing that yet. If we grow and we're successful, there's no, the sky's the limit. There's no reason we couldn't move into Europe, and there's good reasons to do so. It's just that tricky, like, multi-year gap where people are waiting for the right to work. You're going to be on TV.
Video.
I have a question as it relates to the direct cash transfers, and I think perhaps it could be a powerful predictor of the success of Christine's efforts. In countries or in situations where direct cash transfers are used, are you seeing a softening of the host country's attitudes towards refugees in those camps based on the fact that they're kickstarting economic development in surrounding areas?
I don't either. It's a good question. I have not seen data on it, and I can't really think of a case that would prove it. I know in Yemen was one of the first places that did some interesting allowing of, which is weird because now there's a lot of conflict in Yemen, and so it's problematic. This was maybe 6 years ago. They were one of the first countries that was allowing right to work, and I'd imagine there was probably cash transfers going. But I think it's a good hypothesis, but we need to look into it.
So there's a broader context here that I think is helpful in terms of thinking about governments' responses to refugees. Sort of 2 points I would make. One is that all of these countries of first asylum that Christine is talking about, we tend to think, gosh, they're jerks. They should let these refugees work. They are bearing such a hugely disproportionate share of the burden on almost any criteria you would use for trying to figure out who should be paying these costs, right? If you think about capacity, like the people paying the cost, the countries paying the cost should be those with the biggest capacity to do so. It would be wealthy countries should do more. If you think about, okay, who caused the conflict, that's a reason why we think people should pay for things. Again, it's typically not these countries where people are going. If you think who's benefiting from, that's another reason why we think people should pay for things, because they're benefiting. Again, it's not these countries. So, it's really understandable to me why some of these countries of first asylum are resistant. There are things that other countries could do to make them less so by sort of reducing their burden. The other thing that I would say is that I think when we're thinking about this stuff, we need to keep two things in our mind simultaneously, and it's really hard to do that. On the one hand, it is horrible to be a refugee, right, in ways that I personally know that I cannot imagine. On the other hand, a lot of refugees are the lucky ones, right? It takes resources and connection, especially the refugees that get to Europe or the United States. It takes resources, it takes connections. They tend to be more educated. So the people who are either displaced within a country or the people who can't even move within their own country are often, you don't want to compare, but we don't want to lose sight of those people either. And there's sort of orders of magnitude more of them than there are, at least, of refugees in Europe, which is not in any way to discount the absolute suffering of people in Europe, and I don't want to diminish that in any way, but I also don't want our focus on that, because it's what's in the news, to distract us from, the much bigger issue, both of displaced people and of people who are sort of really, really poor and suffering and can't even sort of move to somewhere else in their own country.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Mm-hmm.
I have a somewhat hypothetical question. I'm not sure quite how to formulate it, but if you were to have magic powers, and how would you go about distributing the wealth and the resources better so that people wouldn't be in the kind of dire positions in which they find themselves when their countries are out of control and they have to flee?
Well, on the resource distribution question, I don't think I can answer that. Plus, it's on TV, so I'll probably get death threats. I think on some level, I think in many, many years we'll move toward a world where there are not borders. And that's very controversial, obviously. I heard a man speak in South Africa who remembers the time of apartheid in South Africa when blacks were kept in townships and their movement was restricted and their access to work was restricted. And it feels like such a long time ago, right? Obviously, we can talk about that in this country as well. And the idea, there was once upon a time where no one could imagine a time when apartheid would end, and it did end. I also studied, my first book was on the European Union, and there was a time when no one imagined Europe getting along. No one could imagine a time when there would be no borders in Europe, and then that happened in my lifetime. Now, obviously, there's pushbacks against that right now, but and despite all of the political occurrences here in the United States, I feel like we're on this trend toward a more open society and a more accepting society globally. And so I feel like if people could move freely when they needed to, whether that was from economic pressures or security pressures, that would go a long way to alleviating some of this.
So let me say two things. On the one hand, the first part of this will be amazingly very concrete. I think it's easier to identify. You said, okay, if you had a magic wand and you had all this money, how would you distribute it? What would you do with it? I think it's pretty easy to identify a bunch of things that I wouldn't do, that a lot of people do. So I think it's easier to sort of cross those out. So one thing that I would not care about at all is when you go to the websites of a lot of NGOs, they'll show you, hey, look, there's a map, and they say, we provide aid in 70 countries, or we provide aid in 112 countries. Like, aren't we great because we're working in so many different countries? I do not think that matters at all. So I would not donate to an organization because it's working in more countries. I would think carefully, and people have different views on this, about whether you care whether suffering is caused by intentional active harm or more, there's no such thing as a real natural disaster, or sort of more natural disaster. Like, people disagree on that, and that might help you sort of figure out what you wanted to do with your money. So that's as far as the sort of like concrete what I would do with my money. And the last thing that I would do is I would be really attentive to the way that there's this thing in social psychology called the identifiable victim effect. And it is really easy for us to relate and feel sympathy and empathy for anything involving one person whose face we can see. And I would be very careful to not be taken in by somebody trying to get my money by using like the face of one person, okay? Because I care so much about every person in the world, right? I don't want to be biased towards that one person whose face I could see. Okay, on the other hand, there is a huge, this is like sort of what I would do ideally, right? There's a huge question in development economics about what leads countries to be wealthy, and a sort of separate one about what leads them to be peaceable. I can speak more to the first one, about what leads to economic growth. And I think one thing that you see in the literature is that a really, really big factor are political institutions, stable political institutions, right? Some people think that's the whole story. Some people think that's only part of the story. And so what I would do with my money is I would think about, is there a way, and I think this is an open question, is there a way to transform money into support for people who are trying to improve the political institutions of their own country?
I would ask, what is your take on like Finca and Kiva, like those those organizations where you donate money and then they make a lot of microloans? Are they effective? Because I read one, like you sort of touched on this, but you read one thing and then you read the opposite, and I find myself confused.
So I tried to do a review of the literature on the microloans place, the microlending kind of things. And so the idea here, right, is that there are people who want to start small businesses, and you can go online and you can see like a whole bunch of them, and they all tell you their ideas, and this is how much money they need, and you can give $25 or more to support them, right? And then your money, either you can take your money back when they return it to you, or you can sort of reinvest it into another project. And this uses the identifiable victim effect, right, that I talked about, right? Because it's one person and you can relate to them, and I think there's actually something positive about that. from what I've seen, and I know you know a lot about this too, we were talking about the sort of like the actual like randomized controlled trials and what actually happens. It's really a mixed bag. There are some contexts in which people are able to improve along some dimensions, right? So they look at maternal health, they look at kids in school, they look at the calories people are getting, they look at how much they access medical care, and it's really mixed. This is not a silver bullet as far as I've been able to discern. It's not a total disaster either in most cases, but I think it's an open question, and it varies a lot by context, what these effects are. If you think about it for yourself, right? Think about going into small business for yourself. That's like a really risky and sort of scary proposition, and it's not something that everybody wants to do, and it's not necessarily something that's going to launch you fully sort of into another class position, right? And certainly when we're talking about loans rather than grants. So I think there's a whole conversation about, I think what you were asking about, where you really do have these sort of like predatory rates, right? The cost of the loan. And I think you can sort of like bracket that as sort of like one difficult issue, and then even look at and then what I would look at are the places that don't have those super high rates and say, okay, this is sort of the best case scenario. What's happening? And I don't want to be like super negative about this. I think it's like a really important place for us to sort of look and think about how we can do better. But from what I've seen, I've certainly not gotten the sense at all that this is a silver bullet in any,
right.
in
And
any
I think
kind of way.
you said that it varies by context, and it definitely does. The context is who is the organization running the microfinance, right? So we can see some microfinance organizations that are doing a very good job. They're vetting people. They're not allowing people to take multiple loans. And then we see other cases where in a small town, there'll be 7 different microfinance banks. And I borrow from Harriet, and then I borrow from Jen next week to pay Harriet back, right? And then I get myself into a cycle of debt. Now, is that a problem with the concept of microfinance? No, it's a problem that neither of those banks talk to each other and they're not behaving ethically. So yeah, I think there's a range of different problems, but it's kind of similar to like anything, like, are chocolate chip cookies good? Well, it depends on who makes them, right? Like, it's of course, like there's going to be some microfinance banks that are doing a good job and they're vetting people well and they're responsibly supporting their entrepreneurs, and there's others that won't. So voila.
Thank you. Thank all of you for coming. Thank you so much. And thanks our speakers. Okay. And enjoy the rest of the festival.